Many people say Passover was fulfilled at Yeshua's first coming, so they believe it won't have anything to do with his return. But that's not true. This is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. Let's talk about it. Yahweh's Moedim are appointed times, and just because something big happened on them before doesn't mean something big won't happen on them again. In fact, because something big has already happened on them, it gives reason to believe something big will happen on them again. Though it may not be identical, history is cyclical. Isaiah 46:10 says, "I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come." So, this shows us the past tells us the future. I've been showing for years the different possibilities to how and when the end times could play out. We have to stay open to the multiple different perspectives for when Yeshua could return. And Isaiah 46:10 shows Passover is no different. Passover could even be considered the appointed time of redemption and judgment on Yahweh's calendar. Isn't that what we're waiting for? Redemption and judgment to start? Of course. I know many lean heavily to the fall holy days being when Yeshua returns. Most lean to the Day of Trumpets, mainly because they associate it with the trumpet call at Yeshua's return noted here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. And I'm not opposed to that. I see the logic. However, Passover is a legitimate time for things to begin just the same. It might actually be the most plausible time. I've never made a teaching for Passover regarding Yeshua's return because I've always considered it an obvious possibility. But I'm concerned it may not be as obvious to others as I thought. Did you know the only event in the whole Bible that we're commanded to teach our children is the Exodus account from Egypt? It's seen in Exodus 13 and Deuteronomy 6. He wanted that event ingrained into his people. Please also notice verse 9 in Exodus 13. Look familiar? This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of Yahweh is to be on your lips. Yahweh has Passover as his mark for us, which is why the Antichrist will have his. And the version the Antichrist has may very well just be a corrupted version of the original. But shouldn't we at least consider it interesting how Yahweh says Passover is a sign for us? But again, Passover is the only event in biblical history that Yahweh commands his people to teach their children. So anytime even the slightest reference is mentioned, it won't be missed. Things an everyday believer might be missing, but one who studies and teaches Passover will be far more apt to catch the references. Consider the following verse in Revelation 11 regarding the two witnesses. Believe it or not, it points to Passover. It says, "Their bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified." Now, you're probably thinking, how does this verse point to Passover? Let me show you. At Passover in Jerusalem, Jesus took our judgment on the cross, and because of that, he delivered us from our sin. Judgment and deliverance. Again, Passover. It could also be understood that he provided the Passover sacrifice for when the judgment and deliverance comes on the evening of a future Passover. In fact, that would explain why he only quoted the first part of Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, where he specifically omitted the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. That which comes next, deliverance and judgment. Passover. We see the same with Egypt. Yahweh declared judgment would come, resulting in the deliverance of Israel. Again, judgment and deliverance at Passover. And then we have Sodom. Now, you're probably wondering, what in the world would Sodom have to do with Passover? Let's go to Genesis chapter 18, where we see the promise of Isaac. In verses 10 through 14, we see it told that 1 year from that same time they would have a son. Well, what time is that? An appointed time. The Hebrew says a moed, one of Yahweh's appointed days. So right here we see they were at an appointed time. And what was the purpose of that visit? Judgment, as seen in verses 20 through 23. From there, the two angels walked down to Sodom. Lot sees the two angels and brings them into his house. He makes them a feast with unleavened bread. When do Hebrews make unleavened bread? For the feast of unleavened bread. What happened? Lot and his family were delivered, and judgment fell on Sodom. So, there's judgment and deliverance in Sodom, judgment and deliverance with Egypt, and judgment and deliverance with Yeshua in Jerusalem. All three connecting in Revelation 11, verses 7 and 8. So, is this verse in Revelation 11 giving us a clue to when things will begin? That being Passover? Will Isaiah 46:10 come true in light of Passover being when the deliverance and judgment begins for the end times? Thus, the words of Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. Then the Lord knows how to rescue godly men from trials and hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment, while continuing their judgment. Deliverance and judgment at the same time. Paul discusses judgment and deliverance comes at the same time in 2 Thessalonians as well. Judgment and deliverance. Passover. The prophet Isaiah also gives us a hint of it all starting on Passover. Isaiah even associates it with the resurrection. Isaiah 26, starting in verse 19. But your dead will live, their bodies will rise. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. Go, my people, enter your rooms and shut the doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until his wrath has passed. See, Yahweh is coming out of his dwelling to punish the people of the earth for their sins. The earth will disclose the bloodshed upon her. She will conceal her slain no longer. This is Passover language, and you can clearly see the deliverance and judgment noted together, and we see it mentioned with the resurrection. Will those who have Yeshua as their Passover lamb be redeemed at Passover and judgment start on all others? Consider even what we read in Hosea regarding the resurrection, like we see in Isaiah. See if you see any Passover references given when the resurrection is mentioned. Hosea 13:14. I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. Where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? I will have no compassion. Plagues? Like the plagues in Egypt? Destruction? Like that of the noted destruction of the firstborn on the night of Passover? This is Passover language, all referenced with the resurrection. We can't ignore this. So what are some other references to Passover throughout the scriptures that we might be missing? Let's look at Passover in Egypt. Who was the death angel? Yahweh said he would pass over them. Now, many English translations say he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. However, the Hebrew says he would not give destruction, showing it was Yahweh, not a death angel. This is confirmed just 4 verses later in verse 27, where it says he struck down the Egyptians. The Hebrew says it was Yahweh who brought the destruction that killed every firstborn in Egypt, and specifically killed the firstborn son of Pharaoh, while Israel is protected. So, Yahweh brought the destruction, specifically on the son of Pharaoh. So, just like with the verse in Revelation 11, could there be other clues we've been glancing right over? Paul refers to the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, as the son of destruction, a Passover reference. The son of destruction, destruction brought by Yahweh on the firstborn son of Pharaoh. Consider also how Passover is the only appointed time that deals directly with a door. In fact, with the command noted earlier to teach our children about the Passover out of Egypt in Deuteronomy, we see the command to obey Yahweh's law is directly related with observing the Passover. Think about it. Passover, the appointed time where the blood of the lamb was placed on the doorframe. Passover, the event we're to teach our children about, is referenced directly with the law of Yahweh. Is it any wonder then that's why Yahweh instructed his people to place his commands on their doorframes in the first part of that same chapter, giving a Passover reference right in front of us at all times to those who obey his instructions, to never forget Passover as we keep his instructions. The blood was put on the doorframes. His instructions are put on the doorframes to be the reminder of Passover at all times. Faith and obedience, all in one. So now we put his instructions on our doorframes, just like they put the blood of the lamb on the doorframes. Think about it. Life is in the blood, as noted in Leviticus 17:11. And what is said of Yahweh's commands? His commands are not just idle words. They are our life. Life in the blood. His words are our life. And both go on the doorframes. And Yeshua, who is the way, the truth, and the life, is the Word who is our Passover lamb, the only way of salvation. The connections of placing his commands on our door, like that of the blood of the Passover lamb, with Yeshua being our Passover lamb, who is the Word, is almost overwhelming. It's all tied together to Passover. So Passover is the only appointed time dealing with the door, now likened with putting his commands on our doors. Now, please consider the Passover door references we could have been overlooking. Revelation 3:8. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. This is said to the church of Philadelphia, the only church told they would escape all things. Only one other church in Revelation has a door mentioned to it. It's the church of Laodicea, the only church that was doing nothing right. Judgment was coming their way if they didn't repent. And where was Yeshua? At the door. So here we see two churches with a door specifically mentioned to them. One promised deliverance, and the other warned of judgment. Passover, deliverance, and judgment, all with the door. Consider also James 5:9. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. What door? The Passover door that separates the followers of Yeshua from destruction. If the Lamb is not inside with you, he will bring judgment on you. And then, of course, we have Revelation 4:1, the door standing open. Could this really be giving us the timing of when everything starts? Something that's been right in front of us all this time. The door of Passover? In Matthew and Mark's account of Yeshua discussing the end times, he said when we see those things happening, we would know it's at the door. Destruction is at the door. Again, a Passover reference. Could he have been giving us the timing, and we just haven't been seeing it? The timing of it all being at the door. The Passover door where destruction is just outside. This all being said, let's consider all Yeshua said in Luke 13 in association with the end and the door. Luke 13, starting in verse 23. Someone asked him, "Lord, are only a few people going to be saved?" He said to them, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door." And yes, the Greek says door. This is a different account versus entering through the narrow gate. Continuing, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to. Once the owner of the house gets up and closes the door, you will stand outside, knocking and pleading, "Sir, open the door for us." But he will answer, "I don't know you, or where you come from." Then you will say, "We ate and drank with you, and you taught in our streets." But he will reply, "I don't know you or where you come from. Away from me, all you evildoers." There will be weeping, there will be gnashing of teeth, when you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, but you yourselves thrown out. People will come from east and west and north and south, and will take their places at the feast in the kingdom of God. We see the door. We see the door is closed. People will beg to be let in. They see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God eating at the feast in the kingdom of God. These verses could even imply the resurrection takes place on the day of Passover, the day the door is closed and all the saints are gathered together. Interestingly enough, Yeshua said he would not partake of the fruit of the vine until we're in the kingdom. But look at verses 24 and 25 of Luke 13 again. The door, people are let in. The door is shut. People are locked out, pleading to be let in. Does this story sound familiar? It should. Look how it parallels with what's said in the parable of the 10 virgins. The two stories are virtually identical. The door, people are let in. The door is shut. People are locked out, pleading to be let in. Also, notice verse 6 here in Matthew's account. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." This in itself is another possible reference to Passover. You see, there's a time in history when those who didn't believe, believed at midnight. When was that? At the Passover in Egypt. Exodus 12:29 and 30 shows at midnight a cry is heard in all Egypt on the night of the Passover. Could the midnight cry referenced by Yeshua in the parable of the 10 virgins be him giving us a hint to the timing of his return? At midnight on Passover, just like in Egypt, the time of redemption and judgment at the same time. Thus, Paul's words to the Thessalonians saying Yeshua's return will be like a thief in the night. Let's continue with other clues that point to Passover. Trust me, there's many more. Amos chapter 8, verse 9. In that day, declares sovereign Yahweh, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious feasts into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. First, notice the Passover language regarding mourning for an only son, and it being a bitter day. But the Hebrew actually doesn't say son. It just says only, implying the firstborn, just like it was in Egypt, and weeping was heard throughout because of all the firstborn who were killed. This is likened exactly to what Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 6. And the Hebrew is the same regarding the only. But not only that, back to the account in Amos. As noted in other teachings, this could be understood as the feast days the Jews have added, like Hanukkah and Purim. However, when we celebrate the feast days of Yahweh in accordance to how we want to celebrate them and not how He instructs, we take His days and turn them into our days because we aren't observing them as He gave. Thus, they aren't His days anymore. Our disobedience turns them into our days. As noted in our teaching on the Abomination of Desolation, the sacrifices in the end times won't be in accordance to the ways of Yahweh. Thus, it'll all be an abomination to Him. They'll turn His days into their days because they won't be following His instructions for them. So, the day the Passover is to be done, it won't be His day they're observing. Because of their abominations, the days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread will be their feast days that gets turned into mourning, as Amos prophesied. So, the sun could go dark at noon on Passover, as noted here in Amos. And for what it's worth, this could very well be the New Jerusalem standing in front of the sun, blocking out its light. Something the world has been prepared for and will say it's an alien invasion. We have a teaching on this if you're interested. It's linked below. Now, when was the last time the sun went dark on a Passover? You guessed it, on the Passover when Yeshua was crucified. 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8 tells us Yeshua is our Passover lamb, and we know He saves us from our sin. Since Yeshua's our Passover lamb, shouldn't that tell us something about the judgment to come? If we're waiting for judgment to come, wouldn't Passover be a night to equally watch, and we make sure we have Yeshua as our Passover sacrifice to save us from that coming judgment? Consider what Paul said to the Romans. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. Is this a hint for the night of Passover? Yeshua is our Passover lamb. We must stay in Him until He comes, just like they were to stay in their homes until morning. Plus, after saying everything Yeshua did regarding the end times in Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25, look what He says immediately after. Matthew 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, He said to His disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away." He gave all that information about His second coming exactly 2 days before Passover. Surely this wasn't a coincidence. Is it a clue we've just overlooked? A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day, right? Is Yeshua telling us it all starts on Passover in 2 days? On Passover in 2,000 years? You can say I'm stretching things here, and maybe so. But we all know He doesn't waste words. Everything is said with a purpose and intention. And after discussing such a major topic for 2 chapters straight, I find it hard to believe the Hebrew idiom of a day to 1,000 years should be completely disregarded. Passover, the first time Yeshua came like a lamb. The second time, 2,000 years later, will be like a lion. Many of you know, I believe it's very possible we could have a warning time as well. Something equal to what Noah had, or even just a 1-day notice like that of Lot. I mean, even Pharaoh was warned, but ignored it. But time will tell if we have any kind of warning. But I do believe it's important to note how Pharaoh and the Hebrews were told what's coming on the 10th day of the month in the Exodus account. So, is it possible we'll at least get that? Maybe. But that also goes into how we'll know the day and not the hour. Many misquote Yeshua in Matthew 24, verses 35 and 36, where he says, "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." But the context Yeshua is talking about here is heaven and earth passing away. If you're truly interested in this, you can see our written teaching titled, Knowing the Day. Remember, Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 4, "But you, brothers, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief." So, just like the Hebrews knew the day, but not the hour in Egypt, the same applies to us, giving all the more of a reason that we should be looking to Passover. And hopefully, we get a warning like that. If we have something like that, meaning a warning, I sincerely believe we'll see the Ark of the Covenant come out and they begin making the 7-day sacrifices for the altar and the priesthood. I truly believe that could be the call Yahweh gives in saying, "Come out of her, my people." I believe the difference this time around is that all the plagues overcome her at once versus what we saw in Egypt. Thus, it will be like in the days of Noah, happening all together, but on Passover. Back then, he delivered his people out of Egypt. This time, he delivers his people out of Babylon. There's so many plausible possibilities, and I believe we need to stay open to all of them. But whenever that time comes, we need to have the strength to leave it all behind. Luke 21:36 says, "Be always on the watch, and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man." The word for able here actually means strength. Thus, we should pray for the strength to be able to leave it all behind. Remember, at Passover, Lot's wife looked back. She didn't have the strength to leave it all behind. Will you? Remember, the account from Luke 13 that showed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the prophets and all those gathered from the four corners sitting down at the meal together? Well, Yeshua was actually quoting from Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah says, "See, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. Among them will be the blind and the lame, expectant mothers, and women in labor. A great throng will return." However, this very same account in the Septuagint says he gathers them specifically for the Passover meal. Jeremiah 38 in the Septuagint is virtually the same to Jeremiah 31 in most modern translations of the Bible. And this is in the context of the New Covenant, as verses 31 through 34 shows in both texts. The point being here is, there's evidence for us to be looking at the Passover season for the return of Yeshua. His words line up specifically with what is given to us in Jeremiah. All these verses are tied to Luke 13. And they all show that just as Yahweh delivered his people at Passover and brought them into the first covenant he made with Israel as a whole, Yeshua may very well establish the new, second covenant after he delivers them at a Passover just the same. This leads us to Psalm 18. Yeshua said in Matthew 23:39, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" This is a direct reference to Psalm 18. This psalm was sung, and still is by some today, when they choose their Passover lamb on the 10th day, and when they sacrificed it at the temple on the 14th. I've also heard where many would go on their roofs and sing this psalm up to heaven, singing it as a prayer for the Messiah to come and save as Yahweh saved them in Egypt. But again, they did so on top of their roofs. Now, if this is true, this would explain Yeshua's words when he said, "On that day, no one who is on the roof of his house with his goods inside should go down to get them. Likewise, no one in the field should go back for anything." Now, the scriptures give multiple verses that discuss a time of purification for those not in right standing with Yahweh, much like what we see with the 5 foolish virgins. This is seen in these verses: Daniel 7:21, Daniel 8:12, Luke 21:24, Revelation 13:7, and Revelation 13:10. These verses show a time when many of Yahweh's people go through a hard time of purification, a time of crushing. But again, the end times is when we see deliverance and the judgment of Yahweh's people at the same time. The blessing for the obedient and the refinement for the disobedient together. Just as Israel was to obey by putting the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, his commands are to be on our doorposts today for us to pursue. Those who obey will be found in him. Those who don't will be left outside, where there will be weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Daniel gives the length that this time will be in Daniel chapter 12. So, if that judgment begins at a Passover in the end times, like it did in Egypt, how would that coincide with what Daniel was given for the end times? As I've discussed in other teachings, Daniel chapter 12 mentions the time, times, and half a time. The words given here are moed, moedim, and chatzi, the holy days of Yahweh as described in Leviticus 23. And chatzi means half, or in the midst of. This is not referencing years, but rather the holy days of Yahweh. This time frame is specifically discussing that time of judgment on the people of Yahweh, the refinement of the 6 churches during the tribulation, the 5 foolish virgins, those outside the door where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. This verse shows how the tribulation will be much shorter than many believe to be. We'll put our teachings here that explain how it's all shortened in the description below. The verses here show Daniel didn't understand this. Why? Because in chapter 8, he was told this time of judgment would last 1,150 days. But now he's told it's only going to last for 3.5 moedim, the time when the host of Yahweh's people are trampled down. I've considered multiple ways in how verse 7 can be applied to the appointed times of Yahweh, and not years. Many try to say it means years, but again, the Hebrew doesn't say Shana. It says Moed. If that judgment begins at the time of Passover, it could be considered this way. Passover would be the first Moed. The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the 50-day Feast of First Fruits to Shavuot could be the Moedim. And it concludes in the midst of the Day of Trumpets. Then the fall feasts begin to be fulfilled when Yeshua starts taking over. That will quite possibly be when the Battle of Armageddon begins. Speculation, I get it. But we can't ignore these verses in Daniel 12 that specifically says that time of persecution only lasts for 3.5 moed. The first deliverance happened at a Passover, leading up to the marriage covenant happening 50 days later on Shavuot, Pentecost. So, could we see a similar pattern take place for the new covenant? Could we see the 5 wise virgins represent those who were ready and in right standing with him, and they're taken to a place of protection, while the 5 foolish virgins have to undergo a time of tribulation up to Shavuot? Then all 10 virgins are then resurrected for the marriage covenant? Possible. Or could the resurrection take place on Passover? Many of you know how I easily see Shavuot for the resurrection as it relates to a 50-day count. And Yeshua said he would raise his followers up on the last day. So, to me, it makes sense how Shavuot could be that time frame, as it's a 50-day count. Thus, they're resurrected on the last day of the counting. However, I can see an equal case given for Passover just the same. In Egypt, Passover was the last day of their bondage. So, could the same be applied to Passover at Yeshua's return? That being the last day of our bondage under Babylon? I don't know. In conclusion, why are people not allowed in the doorway for the Passover meal? I'm talking about the 5 foolish virgins and those noted in Luke 13. Here's the thing. Who's allowed to participate in Passover? The scriptures tell us only those who are circumcised. Even when Joshua took over after Moses, all the men had to be circumcised for Passover before they entered the land. While circumcision is not a requirement for salvation, circumcision of the heart is. Yahweh states it several times. Deuteronomy 10:16, Jeremiah 4:4, Jeremiah 9:25. Circumcision of the heart is not a New Testament thing. It's an Old Testament thing that carried right over into the New Testament. Those who have circumcised hearts will be the ones who are allowed in for the Passover feast with Yeshua. All others will be left outside, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, just like in Egypt. But what does it mean to be circumcised in the heart? It means your heart's desire is to walk in his ways. Thus, Deuteronomy 10:12 and Deuteronomy 11:13. It means your heart's desire is to walk in obedience to him. That's why those with circumcised hearts will be the ones who get the law placed in their hearts for the new covenant, as noted here in the prophecy of the new covenant of Jeremiah 31. Why would Yahweh place his law on someone's heart when they have no desire to pursue it now? And this was all prophesied to happen by Moses in Deuteronomy 31. When we return to Yahweh with all our heart, desiring to obey all his word, he will gather us from all over the world, just as Jeremiah in Luke 13 says. He will seal that circumcision by placing his law in our heart, thus enabling us to truly obey all his law again. Thus, those allowed in represent the first fruits of all who are circumcised spiritually in the heart. All the rest will be circumcised at the end of the millennium, at the end of the 7th day, at the second resurrection, making all circumcised on the 8th day, just as is required in the Torah. And this is why Yahweh said this in Exodus 4. Exodus 4:22. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says, Israel is my firstborn son. And so, Yahweh's people are to be circumcised in the heart if they are to be allowed through the door for the Passover meal when Yeshua drinks of the vine again with us in the kingdom, showing us Passover has not been fulfilled in the way many like to say. And it will most likely play the key role to Yeshua's return. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.